Yeah, thank you all for joining today's lunchtime data mesh webinar. I hope you all had a good start to the week so far. My name is Aileen Pistorius. I'm the head of marketing Europe at Thoughtworks, and I will be your host for today. If you're unfamiliar with Thoughtworks, we are a global technology consultancy that integrates strategy, design, and engineering to drive digital innovation. We are over 12,500 people across 50 offices in 18 countries. And today, our European head of data and AI, Danilo Sato, and principal engineer Kiran Prakash will discuss the benefits of using the data mesh approach and the disadvantages of a centralized data management system, drawing on real-life data projects. I'm sure you're all very familiar by now with the Zoom webinar settings, but just a quick reminder, you are all muted. The chat is disabled, so please add your questions using the Q&A functions. We will allow, of course, like a lot of time at the end of the presentation for your questions, so don't worry about this. And if you prefer to follow us by closed captions, please select the CC button below in the toolbar. Today's session will be recorded and we will share the recording with you next week. And with that, I will hand over to Danilo and Kiran.
Thanks, Aileen. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Just a brief agenda of the topics we're going to cover today. This webinar is a follow-up from a recent white paper that we sponsored the Harvard Business Review to publish on the benefits of using data mesh beyond technology, which we'll have a link for it at the end if you haven't read that yet. And we are expanding a little bit on that as well, using some of the client experiences we've had to talk a bit more about how they are approaching the journey, how to align the data vision with the business. So hopefully you'll get a little bit more out of this than what's in the white paper. And as Aileen said, we'll take some questions at the end. For those that are not familiar with data mesh, I did put together a bit of an introduction here. And I like to start with this survey result. So this is something that we track every year. New Vantage Partners, they survey a lot of data executives on Fortune 1000 companies. And every year they publish results. So we like to keep track on that. They published the 2023 edition this month. So it's fresh numbers. And a few interesting stats from that report is that despite the current environment, the economic situation, 84% of the organizations that reported they're increasing their investment in data and analytics this year. But there's a stat that keeps cropping up every year. It used to be a higher percentage. This year it dropped a little bit. But when asked executives what is the main challenge for them to turn their organization really to become data-driven, they're still reporting, the vast majority, 80%, saying that people, process, culture are the main challenge and not technology. Last year, it was over 90%, so it reduced a little bit. But the other interesting thing they track, and they've been asking this throughout the years, is more not just the investment increasing, but also what kind of value are they getting from that investment? And they ask that in a few different ways. So you can see here how it's tracked over the years, and you can see some of them improve, some of them have dropped, but it tends to be not even close to 100% reporting success in some of these measures. So for instance, the one that's the highest at around 60% is executives claiming that they are able to drive business innovation with data, which is pretty good. When we go down around, competing on data, managing data as an asset, it drops a little bit more, under 50–40%. And then when we get to being able to create a data-driven organization or establishing a data culture, given the challenges on the previous slide, it's not surprising, but only around 25% are claiming success on that measure. So it's still a big gap, I think, that we need to think about as leaders in data and analytics, because if we're still investing a lot, we should be able to articulate that value and help show some significant progress around driving those transformation goals. Getting more a little bit into data mesh, the high-level definition at the moment is that it's a decentralized social technical approach for how we govern, share, access, and manage analytical data at scale. And there are a few key terms here highlighted, because I think is what differentiates a little bit from the traditional approach. The first one is decentralized. So data mesh acknowledges the complexity of large organizations, that you can only go so far with a central team or a central platform to gather all the data in one place. And really, if you're trying to tackle these challenges at scale, you will need to start thinking how to decentralize the use and the ownership and access to data so that everyone across the business can get what they need. And that's how you unlock the value and you drive that transformation. The other key term is not just a technology change. So we do need to put technology and build some platforms in place to support this way of operating. But there's a big social change as well, how we think about team structures and ownership of data, organizational structure, accountabilities, roles. So that shouldn't be overlooked because it's key to operating in this new way as well. We don't just devolve the ownership and keep people with the same skills or doing the same thing they're doing today. There's a whole kind of organization transformation and change management that needs to be thought through. And then the last two is analytical data, and is mostly acknowledging that in today's world, we shouldn't think about analytics as a separate thing as much as we've done in the past, because a lot of the applications of analytics is getting closer and closer to what we used to consider the operational world before. If we're training machine learning models, we're trying to do decision-making in real time. It's not like analytics can be done post-factum after we move the data from the operational to the analytical space. We want that analytics to actually take place in the operational world as well. We need a way to bring the two worlds closer together. And then scale, which leads me to my next slide as a key aspect when data mesh will make more sense. This is from the book. So Jamak is our former colleague. She coined the term, and the book was published last year. But she's talking about that inflection point and what's been happening with how we traditionally have been managing and using data, and where data mesh comes to offer a new way of thinking. So if we think about, on the y-axis, the impact or the value that we're getting from the investment we're putting in data, whether it's through how fast we can respond to the market, how resilient to change, so we can quickly react to changes. And if we think about scale growing on the x-axis in terms of complexity of the business, or just how much data we're using or use cases that we're trying to build with data, many companies, when they're starting off, we will start with a central team. We'll bring that expertise in a central team. We'll start building a central platform, and that does give value. You start unlocking some of that impact by following that approach. What happens is, as the scale grows, what we see is that the centralized approach starts to become a bottleneck. So you might have the central data team being super busy or not having enough capacity to serve all the needs. Then you start having, you start hiring more data scientists to do more work around your data, but they cannot get access to the data they need. You start seeing the structure crackling as you get to that scale growth. And that is where data mesh will start to make more sense. So it's important, I guess, to think here. We don't approach this as data mesh solves is for everyone. We shove data mesh as a solution for every situation. But it's really at that inflection point, if you're starting to feel some of those pains, where it will start making more sense. I'll quickly go through. The data mesh is built on top of a few principles. And if you've seen this, we will put a poll live to ask a little bit about your, how do you think these principles might be easy or hard to implement in your organization. But we start with the domain ownership. So when we decentralized, the lens that we use is this idea of thinking about ownership across domains. And this is domains in the domain-driven design sense of the world, trying to link what we do in data and technology with how the business is organized. So we're trying to devolve ownership and authority for data to the people that have the most knowledge and understand it the most. And we're trying to connect them together. The other key principle is thinking about data as a product. So not just having data assets or data sets that get moved around from team to team and transformed and passed forward, but really bring that product thinking into the data space. So if now domains own the data, who are the consumers of the data? What do they need? What are the SLOs or the SLAs we can put around how the data is exposed? What are the contracts that we are willing to agree for how the data will be shared? What's the best format or the best shape for data to be exposed? So really bringing that product thinking into data. And then the other two principles is the way to try to organize this decentralized federated system. So one key one is that self-serve data platform. So we're building the infrastructure and the data platform in a way that enables these data products to connect to each other, to exchange data, to be interoperable. And this is to avoid, if you take only the other two principles, you might end up, well, we already work like this, but we have these jointed data platforms because each data team is building using their own tech stack and they don't talk to each other. So it's really hard to exchange data. So by bringing that platform thinking, we want to solve that problem to have a common way for how these data products are managed and created. And then self-serve is the key there, because you don't want the data platform team to become the new bottleneck in this way of working. So they need to be building the platform as a product that makes it easy for these data product teams to get what they need without having to ask them to do work for them. And then the last principle is federated computational governance, which is a lot of terms. But the approach to governance in data mesh, first of all, federated, because we are operating in this decentralized way. So we want to bring representatives from these different domains alongside people that are traditionally involved with governance, like InfoSec or cybersecurity, compliance, or anything like that, that you need to take a holistic view. We want to apply that to the whole mesh as a whole, but have participants in the mesh have a say on how it gets applied. And then the other key term in that principle is the computational part. So if that group or that forum decides on policies or the ways of working, as much as possible, we would like to automate that, bake that into the fabric of that data platform so that we don't have to put process in place to check if people are following the policies. We would automate that to either enforce that the policy is applied everywhere, or where it can be local policies can be override things. You want to monitor that. So you still have a plane, to bring a common place to look across governance and how these data products are evolving, but basically monitoring how they are adhering or not to the governance policies that we set. So these are kind of the 4 key principles. We'll quickly look at the results from the polls to see where we're at. Which principle is the most challenging? And we've got interesting domain ownership and data as a product came up at the top. So that is a good segue. I'll hand over to Kiran. He'll start discussing a little bit more about the value of using data mesh.
Yeah, thanks, Danilo. Indeed, like the poll results are interesting because if you notice the domain ownership is all about like the organizational change, and we are going to cover that topic in somewhat detail in rest of the talk. But the first thing is, what value should you expect if you do this right, if you do data mesh right? And next slide. And we think the main sort of primary benefit is the increased return of investment you get from your data and AI initiatives. As already hinted at by Danilo, after your organization grows beyond a certain stage, a lot of the investment you make into your data and AI goes into just servicing your technical debt, because the central team just cannot keep up with the demand, or they take shortcuts because they're overwhelmed, or they don't have the specific knowledge of the domain that they're building the products for, right? And we think by moving to more of this federated structure, 2 things happen. One is that you can manage these teams better, like direct fundings for teams which are actually generating value. And also the second thing is the team get to operate with much more sort of clearer focus. They know exactly what they need to do in order to sort of advance the domain that they're working with. And this is what we think will result in sort of getting the return on investment on the investment you are making on your data and AI. And the second thing we do notice is that it opens up new revenue streams and use cases which were not possible before. For example, if there is a use case which requires 2 or more of your departments to sort of collaborate at near real time, a lot of the times it's simply not possible because the infrastructure and the processes and the governance to do that sustainably at scale doesn't just exist, right? And this is what we think are the main benefit. And of course, like it will shorten your kind of time to insights and put more focus on value you're generating with your data instead of just solving the same engineering problems again and again. Next slide, please. With that, we do see like a few different clear patterns in which like the clients take in order to sort of take on this journey. And one of the next slide, Danilo. One of the common advice we share with all our clients is that all of these 4 principles that Danilo talked about, they are kind of interlinked and they reinforce each other. They don't work as well if you leave one of them out, right? So, and you need to be clear-eyed about the fact that adopting this principle has implications beyond just technology. If you look at the first 2 principles, so domain orientation is about how do you align your data engineering teams closer to the domains. This means this would require you to maybe change your reporting structure, make those engineering teams also accountable and answerable for business and not just for IT. And data as a product is mostly about the culture shift, bringing in that mindset of product to data instead of just treating it as an asset that you store away somewhere. Now you need to sort of serve your customer and they need to use product to build useful things. And that's primarily a kind of a culture and a mindset shift. It also requires you to hire or groom new roles, roles like data product ownership, which probably doesn't exist in your organization, right? Only once you have these data product teams working closely with the domains, the rest of the principle is about how to make them faster. How do you give them the infrastructure and platform capabilities? How do you kind of give them clear architectural guidelines and the governance so that they can focus on business value, generating business value, rather than solving hard engineering problems over and over again. So this is, if you go to the next slide, please. So one of the common pitfalls we observe is that the organization kind of leaning towards one or the other of these levers. For example, if you frame this as only as a technology shift without the necessary organizational changes I spoke about, you run the risk of delivering something which is not aligned with the business. And after a while, you may find yourself that your organization will fall back to the old habits and old ways of doing things. Things like shadow IT, exchanging data files on network drives, and building more and more platforms, which is not really useful for business, right? On the other hand, if you just frame this as a organization or governance change without building the platform, you may not enable the data product teams to operate in this new federated environment. So they do need new platform capabilities and new tools so that they can support those products well. And they also need clear guidelines about what the data product is about. How do I build it, and what are the SLOs and SLIs I need to sort of support, and how do I publish them, right? So they need like clear guidelines in order to sort of make those data products interoperable and useful. So it's also important that you focus on that aspect of governance and the platform capabilities. So this is something to watch out for, right? You need to pull on both of these levers at once and make progress on each of those fronts to deliver, to get the most out of your data mesh. With that, we do see that the clients have a kind of a natural tendency to sort of lean on one or the more principle based on what they perceive as the most challenging, as we saw in the poll. And Danilo is going to take some examples of how those journeys and what are the implications on focusing on those principles look like.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. I'll not pick all of the principles, but just to reinforce what Kiran said, we're not suggesting you can only do one principle. Maybe think of it more as these 4 principles are related, but you might pull on one of them first, and it will bring the rest of them to guide your journey. So I'll pick the one where maybe the first thread is around the self-serve platform. So this is usually that technology-led approach that Kiran was talking about. It's a common scenario. A lot of this is because people that tend to resonate with the ideas of data mesh, it's not by coincidence, it's maybe by design, because Zhamak, when she created the concept, the inspiration for a lot of these principles is for how we evolved and scaled engineering organizations in the past. So there are lots of parallels with what we might be doing in the engineering world that are it's applying those ideas into the data space. So technology folks will resonate and understand a little bit more. Just a thing to call out, and maybe one suggestion if we're taking this route, the call out here is avoid that idea of we're just going to build a platform, we'll spend some time investing in the platform and then the usage will come. So that approach tends to be, you're not connecting that build of the platform with the value that it's going to deliver. So to counter that, even if we're taking that technology led first, we should still deliver and slice the work in end-to-end thin slices. So we have some examples here through the webinar to talk about, but Thoughtworks, we like to think a lot about, even we'll build the platform as a consequence, right? But we will try to link to what is the value, what are the first things that are going to be built on top of the platform as well. So you're not just thinking about the platform in isolation. An example here, actually the first data mesh platform where Jean-Marc came up with some of the ideas was a large commercial health organization in North America. And we took this approach. It was about building a lot of this platform capability to make it easier for teams to build and share data products. So there was an initial investment, 6 months, to build those platform capabilities. And then once that capability was in place, we were able to very quickly build 50 data products live in production within 2 months. So we built that muscle in the platform to really remove the barriers for how you provision the data. But I think where it proved the value, this was work that we were doing before the pandemic. When Jean-Marc started coming up with the ideas, it was before that. But when the COVID-19 pandemic started, they obviously came up with new use cases. So the idea of time to market, right? All of a sudden, we will need some new data products because we want to build this symptom checker tool. We need to understand the healthcare capacity across our organization. We're going to offer telemedicine. So these new use cases required, we're going to need new data products. But the fact that we invested in the early platform capability, they were able to very quickly deliver 8 new data products in under 3 weeks when those new use cases arrived. So it's an example. It was still, 6 months investment. I know in the industry, 6 months is considered short, but probably for some of you, because I've seen places where you're investing years of investment to build a platform without having the use cases on top of it. So it might look small, but it's an example, like we're still taking that platform first, but trying to link to those use cases or those value slices that connect to things that business will need, so they quickly see why the platform is there. The other principle that's common is taking that data as a product first. And this is actually a principle I think it's easier for people to resonate because we are all consumers of products. Maybe not data as a product, but the idea of using products, it's something that everyone will be familiar with. And that is a little bit more of the opposite way. It tends to be more like a business-led approach. And because when you define the scope of the product, it's usually going to be tied to the value because you understand who the customer of the product will be and what they're trying to do. So the call outs and the suggestion here, we still should avoid big bang. Even if you're building a data product, don't think about the all and be all, ultimate version of the product that will solve all the needs of the customers and have all the data. We still apply that thin slice approach even to how we build that one product. Identify maybe what's the first slice of data that might be required. So we're still trying to show that frequent and early value delivery in this approach. And then the suggestion here, Kiran will talk a lot more about this, but we like to always work backwards from the use case to the data products. So you're linking that value very clearly, and it also helps you map out because it oftentimes it won't be one data product to solve the entire use case. It's usually going to be a small network or a subset of data products that connected will bring the right data for a data product that will start delivering that value for that use case. So I'll give an example here and then I'll hand over to Kiran to talk about another one. This is an example from some work we've done at the Department of Veteran Affairs in North America. It's an example of one data product. So it calculates this metric called medication possession ratio. NPR. And this is used, there's research that demonstrates that this ratio, if you track it, it can be correlated with potential suicides. And that's for some types of medication. If people are not following protocol, they might be at more risk of that. So it's a very important metric that they track. The VA was already doing that, calculating that, but it was done in disparate ways and maybe for subsets of their population or subsets of the medications that they look after, and using different tools, different states across the US. So really we thought like it will be valuable if we build a product around NPR that's scalable, that it could be computed the same way across all the medications, across all the medical centers that they operate, and looking across a longer history of data. So by building that, we managed to scale that computation and the scope of patients. You see some of the numbers here, about 88% computation, and increase the patient by 77 times and 124 times. Because basically we built the product to be proper production ready data product that can calculate and bring all the data to do it in the same way across the whole department.
Yeah, thanks, Danilo. So the next example we'd like to talk about is Roche. We think it's possibly the largest data mesh implementation out there, and they took more of a holistic approach towards this transformation. Roche, as some of you may already know, is the biggest healthcare and life sciences company out there, along with their pharma and diagnostics business, and they had this vision of being a profitable inside business in the next 10 years and using data to serve their patients better. So you find this in their annual report, etc. And the problem they were facing is that because they are like a large federated organization, their data systems and platforms were fragmented and siloed as well. And they saw this, the upper management saw this opportunity of, if we solve this well, that the department sort of can come together, exchange insights and data to sort of deliver towards this vision much more sort of better, right? And when we got involved with the program in early 2021, so this is where we started. So we very much led with the use case and data product approach that Danilo spoke about. We would work with each domain one by one, trying to understand how are they currently using data? What are the current pain points? What is their vision of how they want to leverage data and AI to achieve their business goal? And come up with a concrete plan or a first thin slice of data product that they can build and the platform capabilities that is needed to go with it, to support it. And we would do this over and over again with other domains. Until so far, we may have covered over 20 domains within Roche. And we created a process of it so that we could repeat that very easily, and we will see that in the following slide. So that's the first thing, right? We also kind of help their platform to evolve how the developer experience of creating and maintaining this data product look like. Because this is key if you have to scale, because you are going to have many of these data products trying to do the same thing. So you want to streamline and create a consistent developer experience so that you can scale. And we also built what is called a mesh experience plane, which is how do the consumers discover the data product within organizations once it's there. And once they discover it, the data product has to mean the same thing, like regardless of which domain or team built it. There shouldn't be surprises that, okay, like one team interprets data product one way and another team interprets another way, and you cannot sort of connect them together, right? So you need to have this, what we call the mesh experience plane of giving that consistent user experience for people who are trying to build on top of these data products. We also worked on that, and right now we think we are on a very solid ground at Roche, and now we are trying to sort of put together like the governance practices so that we start enabling more of these cross-domain use cases, which were simply not possible before, just because there was no way that to connect those siloed infrastructure and exchange data and insights in a scalable way. So we are trying to sort of break down the governance into portfolio governance, which is about like what kind of data products they need to build and own. These domains need to build and own, and technology governance around how do they want to build it so that these data products are interoperable. And how do I enforce these governance rules using automation, leaning on things like fitness functions, infrastructure as code, and dashboards, etc. So that's a very kind of, that's a journey we are really proud of, and this is at real scale, right? Like it's as big as it gets. So coming to the next slide, you may already have noticed that our sort of clear recommendation and bias is towards this data product-led approach to the transformation. I often tell my clients that if you have to pick one of those 4 principles, please pick data as a product, and rest of the principles tend to follow. They tend to sort of fall in place if you have to, if you force yourself to do the data as product well, right? So the rest of the things do tend to follow. And make sure that this principle of working backwards from use case and building and gradually evolving your platform and governance in terms of complexity. You don't want to almost build your mesh at once, right? You want to evolve it one use case, one domain at a time, while sort of gradually dialing up the complexity on your platform capabilities and governance. Next slide, please. So having said that, one of the questions we get often is that, what does this mean for us? How do we start on our journey? And what is the starting point, right? And the first step in the journey is to have a target operating model in mind, right? So at Thoughtworks, we use an operating model which looks like this. You may have your own version, but the intent is what important. And the first step in this operating model is to have the organization-wide sort of vision of how you want to leverage data and AI, and what you want to achieve, and what is your plan of getting there. This needs to be clearly articulated for everyone to see. Once that is there, you want every domain to create their own goals, which contributes towards this vision, and come up with value hypothesis about how do they want to achieve that goal, and what is the good measure of success for that goal looks like, right? We use something called lean value tree to achieve it. You may be using things like OKR, which is totally fine, but the intent here is that it's the first step is to clarify that purpose and vision and the strategy of how to actually get there. This needs to be clearly articulated. On this front, we have a very short anonymous poll on what do you think, like how well this is done within your organization. We'd like you to take the poll and answer it while I continue. So the second part of this operating model is you want to enable your teams to come up with their own data strategy, which is in line with the organization-wide data strategy, come up with a portfolio of data products that they can build. First, they build it to sort of serve their own use case within the domain, but build it in a way that it is usable by others also within the organization, and then enable them to envision this first thin slice that they can actually build. And then move on to the second phase of setting up data product teams who can actually build it in small iterations, all the while sort of measuring the outcome and how it tracks towards the initial measures of success that we set out in the first step, right? And repeat this cycle in smaller iteration. So this is kind of the target operating model we aim at. Can we look at the result of the poll and see where? Oops. We see a classic bell curve. More road towards somewhat articulated and very few on very well sort of articulated. It's quite interesting. So go to the next slide, Danny, please. So to actually achieve this operating model, it helps if you have a repeatable process. A process, something that you can take and kind of repeat in each of your business domains. And we were sort of forced to come up with this process first at Roche because we had this huge task of onboarding 20 plus domains onto this organization-wide mesh. And since then, we have taken this process and tweaked it at many other clients. And we have written extensively about it. This framework is, and also the workshop and the framework we use for it You'll find links in the reference section of this deck, which will be sent out. So please feel free to try it on your own. But the gist of this process is it has two phases. In the first phase, it's all about talking to the domains, trying to understand how they're currently using their data, what is their vision, and what is their pain points. This can be done by just conversation with the leaders within the domain. And as a second step, we work with those leaders to define what good looks like if they embrace the data mesh principles, right? So basically, it could be a short hands-on workshop where we kind of define, go through use cases and see what those principles mean for that domain. Once that is done, we move on to a second phase, which we call onboarding use cases onto the mesh, where we actually come up with this actionable thin sort of first slice of use case, governance, and the platform that they actually can build and basically set up those product teams to actually go and build it. This process may look elaborate, but we have successfully kind of gone and executed end to end in less than 6 months and shown like the first results within that. So this need not be long drawn out process. It can be quite lightweight if we intended to, right? With that, I'd like to pass on to Danilo, who is going to take a concrete example of ITV and walk us through how these steps might look with a concrete use case.
Thanks, Kiran. I'll quickly go through the work we've been doing with ITV. The early results of the initial slices of value here, we actually got recognized last year with an award here in the UK. But the use case took about 8 months to go to production with the first release. And it's in the marketing domain. So the benefit is the marketing team can create and target addressable audiences now, something that used to take 3 months before, because they had to request other teams to do work for them, ask the data team to collect and create the audience, and then get some data back that they would pass to the marketing operations team to set up the campaigns and trigger it. All of that handover and knowledge exchange could take up to 3 months. Now they can do within 3 minutes because it's all the right data and the right ownership is back into the marketing folks to do that in a self-serve way in the new customer data platform that they deployed. Just a high-level timeline. This has evolved already, but we picked, you will see here, one domain as the leading domain to create the initial data products. But we started with a more group-wide data strategy. That was our first engagement, where Sanjeevan, our main stakeholder, he was setting up the vision for data across ITV, and the output of that strategy I'll share. But it's what was used as input into the business case for them to set up the program. And they're really framing data as the key to power their digital transformation in ITV. So a lot of the use cases and the way it's articulated internally, the strategy is very linked to the value narrative. And even throughout the program, we're trying to track against that. So we kicked off around July, as I said, on the marketing domain. We actually had a bunch of releases to production of the data products and the platform. The reason why the end-to-end go live took 8 months is because the CDP was the new operational system that was being set up in parallel to our engagement. And they took a little bit longer to go live. So we've made release to production, but we didn't count as go live until we could actually run a campaign end-to-end through the new system. For the strategy, when we started, they had identified a bunch of value cases across the business that needed a little bit deep dive and validation. But some of the symptoms, maybe things that you will relate to around missing data or the data not being trustworthy, is not shared across the organization, and that lack of alignment between what the data folks are doing and the business people see. A lot of challenges around the ownership. It's not clear who owns what. So we were looking at this holistically, and they didn't call us in to do data mesh, but as we looked at the strategy, it made sense to use data mesh as the approach for the technology and the operating model. And we really built this value-driven data strategy to try to articulate those benefits to the poll question earlier on, really trying to link that back. Okay, if we implement this use case, what is the value? So in the example of our deliverable, well, if marketing team, there's an efficiency value there where you can do things much, much quicker, but that also enables them to run more campaigns now, because if something happens and they have to wait 3 months, maybe it's too late for them to try to connect with their customers. So the fact that they can run more campaigns in faster time, they know what campaign returns gives to them. So we can map that out to a measure of value that the business understands that justifies the investment. So if we look across some of the deliverables, like I said, executive summary for the board, we looked at the operating model, how the team should be structured, how do we, the roles, and how do we engage the different parts of the organization. We talked about the architecture, what the next generation architecture should look like, and build that roadmap. So I'll talk a bit more about the roadmap and how it grows over time. And then in order to fit to the business case, we also looked at the total cost of ownership to operate in this new way. So it could be balanced against the value that it will deliver, and you get a clear ROI articulation that the business and the board can understand. This is how Sanjeevan likes to talk about the approach. He doesn't use as much the word data mesh internally, but the real power, and is what data mesh enables, is creating this knowledge exchange across the organization. So it feeds both how the architecture is built and the operating model. So if you think about all these different groups of business folks across the ITV business, they all have data and they have use cases that they need to do on their own. But the real power is when their data gets exposed for other parts of the business to use and derive maybe new value. You get this kind of network effect when you're sharing and using data across and outside your own domains. This is an example, a little bit simplified, but how we map the value case to feed into the roadmap. So if we think about these columns as some of the core big domains that were mapped out, each pink row represents one of the value cases. So value cases cut across multiple domains oftentimes. And you see here the addressable audiences, for instance, was mostly in marketing, but it's a big overlap with the viewer domain because you need data about viewers to be able to create those audiences and know who you can target with your campaigns. But you can also see, we picked this one to start, viewer domain cuts across many of these value cases. So when we start building some of these data products, it's not only serving this particular value case, but it will be foundation for the upcoming ones. And then the other one, which is the use of addressable audience for their advertising team. Well, turns out the concept of segments and audiences, there's value from the marketing perspective, who they target and, create a segment of people that haven't watched the whole season of Love Island. So in the last 3 months, so we'd want to try to push some adverts for them. We could actually use the idea of segments when we're talking to advertisers, because they sell advert space in the ITV content as well. So they have this concept of common segments that makes sense. So that data product is an example of this cross-domain collaboration that we build for one domain, but is beneficial to unlock value in another domain. Even within the marketing and the value case, we take that thin slice approach one step down. So we didn't solve all of marketing's needs. We were trying to cut that down as well. So, okay, what is the first thing that we can build? And we focus on that paid digital marketing types of campaigns, which is the ones that they can trigger and push adverts or campaigns in the social media platforms, for instance. So there's way more use cases even within marketing for how they do marketing strategy, how do they choose which audiences to target and what different types of campaigns. So once the use case is delivered, there's more work that that domain team will continue to deliver within the marketing area while we expand the data mesh use cases across other parts of the business. So if you look across here, we have the value case mapped out, but we will try to take these thin slices even thinner to deliver the value. So it feeds into that roadmap of how we expand over time. This is the last slide in terms of content, because it's also a question we get a lot is, well, we're advocating for a, start small, pick a value case first, which is, it's a simpler problem sometimes, but how do we actually get to the benefit of using that at scale? So the way we like to think about it is thinking about how the adoption grows in different phases. So maybe the approach we're describing is going to help you in the incubating phase, where maybe you will build some of the foundational platform capabilities for those first use cases, maybe not all of the capabilities. And you start building some of the data products and establishing some of the teams, maybe in one or a few domains. When we hit to that sustaining phase, now the capabilities become a little bit more self-serve. What we built in the incubation phase can be used by other teams that will start building other data products around them. And it becomes that foundation. And then when we get to the scaling phase, that's when you can start reaching, maybe late adopters, people that within the organization need to see some success or some real usage elsewhere before they're ready to adopt. And when you get to that scale of data production and consumption. So think of it like this is a multi-year journey to really get to the scaling maturity of the data mesh, but it shouldn't stop you from thinking big in the beginning and starting small in one area. So with that in mind, we'll quickly summarize some of the takeaways that we covered today, and we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. This is the reference to the white paper that I mentioned in the beginning. The takeaways here are also in the white paper, but the first one, thinking of data mesh as a federated approach to managing data. And unlike the centralized approaches where data will sit and be owned by a central team, usually IT, we are federating that across the business.
Yeah, and the second key takeaway is data as a product is probably the most important thing you would want to get right. And this involves more of a mindset and a culture shift within your organization. Yeah.
Cool. And then the third one is just highlighting what we've been saying a lot, I feel, during the webinar, but we need to engage both technology and business executives in this change because a lot of this relies on rethinking or even restructuring the social infrastructure of the organization. So we don't just pull the change in one side and forget about the other one.
Yeah, and lastly, a lot of the framework and the process that we kind of outlined in the webinar, we have written extensively about it. And once you get this deck, you'll find a reference section where you have like a detailed formats of how you can do these workshops, accelerate workshops, and this repeat this process within your organization. Yeah, do have a look at that once you get the deck.
Cool. And the last one, we talked a lot about this, but I think it's something that we do a lot at Thoughtworks, and not just in data mesh engagements, but really think about those thin slices, trying to deliver those end-to-end value and use that to drive the roadmap. So you can always relate what you're doing to some articulation of value that people understand at the top level. With that in mind, we'd like to thank you all for joining us. We'll hand it over back to Aileen, who help us moderate some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you both for this insightful presentation. I can already see a few questions in the Q&A, and while people keep adding more, I would like to invite those who are unable to stay for the Q&A to respond to our feedback form. We will post the link into the chat, or you can scan the QR code in our virtual backgrounds. So maybe the first question to start with, can you be more elaborate or detailed on the statement building backwards to use case?
Yeah, maybe I can take that. So we spoke about taking this thin slice approach to implementing the data mesh. And maybe once you identify like the first use case and the thin slice you want to build in a domain, the next question is what data products should I build and how big they should be, right? And this is a design question, right? There's no right or wrong answer to it. It's a primarily design question. And one of the thumb rule we find to kind of to identify those fundamental information concept within a domain, that is what we are aiming for, and not to sort of over-engineer, is start with the use case and work backwards to answer the question, what data product do I need to build to satisfy the use case, right? For example, in the case, the ITV case that Danilo spoke about, right? The use case was to have enable the marketing team to launch targeted campaigns, right? So they need a data product called, let's say, addressable audience and campaigns that they can launch towards those targeted sort of audience segments. To build that, you need data from another domain. So first you need data, let's say the content that ITV is producing from their supply chain domain, like that's the shows that they're producing and the intended target audience. And then you also need the data about the users and their demographics from the customer growth domain, like the domain which is in charge of customers and managing their account, subscription, and all of that, right? So the way we identify these what we call data products, source data products, is by working from the use case. Okay, what do I need to build? What data products do I need to have to satisfy this use case? And is this fundamental information concept in that domain and that I'm looking at, right? So it's a thumb rule which we think will inform you to kind of identify the right abstraction and the right granularity of data products that you need to kind of build and not over engineer stuff.
Thanks a lot, Kiran. Then we had a question that came in ahead of the webinar, and it was, I wanted to ask what kind of initiatives have been successful to incentivize data producers and data management activities. As mentioned in the white paper, it can be particularly difficult to get business teams to see the benefit of what is often seen as extra work. So this is an idea I think could be really useful. Danilo, do you want to?
I'll take that one. I think it was a good question. I've had active debate about that with different clients and folks as well. There's no single answer, but I'll share some of the ideas. I agree with that statement. And if you ask many departments or business units, everyone will always have a story about, oh, if we had access to more data, we could do this thing more, that thing more. So everyone is very keen to consume data, but the story about being able to produce and share the data is not always there. And a lot of that is related to, I think, incentives structures as well, like how people are incentivized. And I've seen, like data platform programs that are measuring success by how much data gets ingested. And if you're measuring like that, then obviously the teams will start working towards, I'm just going to ingest as much data as I can, and I don't care if it's being used or not. So there is a question here around thinking about incentive structures so that you incentivize people to actually share. And that relies on having some technical capability in the platform, I think, to measure the usage of data as well. So how do you know which data products are more useful, which ones are unlocking more value? If you're not making that backwards mapping that Kiran's talking about, then you might not even know. So there is, I think the answer to that is a little bit more on that social construct and the incentive model, but there will be some technical capabilities that you need to put in place to enable you to track that and calculate that in a good way. I've heard someone saying about, even trying to gamify the system where people get points when their data products get used by another domain, and you create some kind of leaderboard within the organization. So there's some interesting ideas there, but it's a good question, and it's not a fully solved one, I think.
Cool, thanks a lot, Danilo. There's another one around the minimum organization size the data mesh will work for. The stumbling block I see is the data owners. Many orgs are very small and have very little IT technology functions and likely only a few data-aware people across the entire business.
I can take that. I think it's not a hard and fast size. The lens I would take on that is, if you have a central team that's serving it currently, are they able to cope with the demands that you have? I think maybe look out more for the signals where it starts breaking and the bottleneck symptoms start showing up. And that could be as basic as cognitive load, right? It gets to a point. I think our stakeholder Roche talks about, like, we have 100,000 employees, so much data. There's no way our central team could understand all of this data for everyone and solve everyone's problem. So there will be just a basic cognitive load in that team that they won't be able to cope with all of that stuff. And then the other one is the bottleneck. If you're tracking the workload and how fast data is making available, you start seeing, like, as the needs grow, you start seeing that tapering off. So that will be a sign where it makes sense to start thinking about a different way of working.
Thanks a lot. There are so many questions. We will definitely also get back to you with all the responses, even if we can't answer them today. But the next one would be, can you share a bit about the tech stack you explored to make a data mesh work?
Yeah, so maybe I can take that, right? So there is no single sort of vendor or a tech stack that sort of, I would say, data mesh ready. One thing I do say is that a lot of the tech needed to actually do this well is still evolving, right? It's not already there. We're kind of repurposing a lot of the tech which was built for data lakes and data warehouse. Having said that, what we're seeing is that our clients are building on cloud, right? So any of the public cloud, that's kind of a bare minimum, I would say, especially if you want to do the self-service part, right? And for the storage and compute, we see like people using all the popular ones, things like Snowflake, forgot, like it's not coming to mind, like all the what's the name? Help me.
Databricks.
Databricks, right? Sorry, exactly. Yeah, all of those, and Redshift and all of these tools for storage and compute, right? So yeah, so there is no one particular tech stack, I would say. Bare minimum would be kind of built on a public cloud, which will allow you to do self-service well. And there are like there's some of these cataloging tools that are out there. I don't see like a clear winner. There's still sort of a lot of room to sort of improve, but yeah, so there's a bunch of technologies which are on this public cloud that you can leverage, and we see that clients are leveraging.
Yeah, I agree. I'll add to that just a few references. My colleague Ryan published an article and a talk around selecting technology for data mesh, where he covers some of these questions a little bit more in depth. And we just published a few articles this last week, I think, around an example where, thinking about the platform as capabilities and then trying to map that out to what the tools offer today. And what we've seen is usually is a collection of tools. It's not, to Kiran's point, one thing that you buy and gives you all, but depending what capabilities you're trying to implement, you have to use a collection of them.
All right, and then maybe like one last question. Thinking about customer as a design, where the data has heavy legal and risk implications, so for that, how do you enable data sharing across domains while still keeping things secure? Does data get duplicated in the data mesh approach?
I can answer that because that was something we tackled at the ITV case, actually. Viewer is their version of customer, right? It's people watching and they have the same GDPR concerns. Few things we've done there. So first of all, thinking about that security and privacy by design, engaging the data governance folks early on in the program to call out some of these compliance regulation requirements, setting up the policies. And that translates into, when we build that viewer data product or the customer data product, that they have the source system that's managing that data, which is where a lot of that compliance is already in place. And from the operating model perspective, we want that team to own the viewer data product as well, because they understand that data better than everyone else. And then when we're designing that data product, we might have different, what we call output ports on that product, for who gets access to what and what data gets exposed on each one of those output ports. So for you might have different versions of the data that gets shared. Some maybe it's anonymized, or you can all relate back to personally identifiable information. You enforce that in how you design those output ports, and maybe the ones that do share that, you put much more strict security controls. Who can access that? What other data products are going to consume from that? So you can design your compliance regulation needs around the data product and what data gets exposed to who. And bringing those, security governance capabilities to help you do that.
Kiran, for implementation to show value, there's often a period of time up front to set up the architecture runway. How do you convince the stakeholders about the value of this prep phase?
Yeah, often like how we do it at Thoughtworks is like we involve even the business stakeholders from the beginning, because even if you want to answer the question, what kind of architecture trade-offs you need to make, you need to inform that by what the business want. For example, things like how real time your data needs to be, right? Can you do it batch, or do you want more real time? That depends on the use case itself, right? So we are a big fan of involving business right from the beginning, business representation from right from the beginning. And the second thing is to sort of not to draw out this phase of initial setup, right? You want it to be a few weeks or a few months at best, and as long as you can show value in pretty sort of quickly that is satisfiable to business, I think you should be good.
Thank you. Another question would be, how do you strike optimum balance between analytics AI use case specific data product and a generic data product that can be reused in multiple use cases, maximizing network effect?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. I think when you map out backwards from the use case to the data products, you end up with probably like a web of few data products. And oftentimes, like a data product will be useful for other use cases as well. So if we have a list of use cases, right, if you do that for many of them in sequence, you will start seeing like what are the key ones that get lit up, like maybe the customer data is used a lot, or the product data products used a lot. So that gives you a sense based on how you look at the roadmap. You can prioritize not just which data products you build that are more generic, but also which teams you need to onboard or engage with to build and ideally own those data products.
Okay, maybe another one for you, Danilo. Data ownership seems to be moving outside organizations that rely on software as a services-based products. These have limited accessibility to data. How do you recommend data products are formed from these sources?
Good question. I actually have a slide that wasn't in the deck from the work we've done at ITV to try to illustrate this, because that case study was actually the CDP that got deployed was one of those SaaS-based solutions. And if you look here, this was the high-level architecture for the first thin slice. A lot of the use case relied on bringing that audience data to feed into that CDP. So the CDP was being set up as the new operational system that the marketing team uses on the day-to-day basis. But the audience data product needs to aggregate data from other domains. So the viewer data product comes from the IDMP system and the IDMP team. The viewing activity, what people are watching, would be also aggregated. And then we need some data about the content. So what type of content were they watching to create the ingredients, let's say, for them to explore different audience segments in the CDP. So we build that data product as an aggregate that connects and brings data from the other domains, feed into the CDP. But once, let's say, the marketing team creates the audience segments inside the CDP, we also will think about the audience segment as a valuable product. So when we moved into the second slice, we started building that audience segment data product that is taking the data out of that SaaS system and turning it into a way that it can be exposed in an interoperable way to the rest of the organization. So you don't have to have other teams having to reach right inside the SaaS system, and you use the data products as almost like the abstractions around the SaaS solutions to either feed data into it or to get the relevant data out that's owned inside that system.
All right, thanks a lot. Kiran, there's one question around how to manage data mesh project implementation in big corporations, which are already handling big programs such as SAP modernization programs.
Yeah, so this is definitely one of the fairly common scenario we run into with this huge monolith like SAP or some of the Oracle systems that is undergoing like a parallel replacement or legacy sort of modernization programs. I would say the limiting factor here is primarily the leadership bandwidth. Do you have sort of enough leaders in your organization who can lead your organization through this massive change, which is probably happening on two axes at once? If the answer to that question is yes, then I don't see like a particular technical limitation why this can't be done, right? In fact, if you're kind of embracing a paradigm like microservices on your operational system, you already have some of these domain boundaries figured out, which you can use as a forcing function to inform your sort of domain boundaries and data product teams, right? So it kind of helps in that sense to have those sort of the same style of architecture for your legacy replacement as well. But yeah, so I'd say the main limiting factor is the amount of the bandwidth. Do you have enough sort of leaders and energy to sort of handle both these changes at once? So that's the main question, and yeah, that you need to answer within your organization.
Thanks a lot, Danilo and Kiran, for this great session today. We are looking forward to hearing your feedback. We have shared a link to the feedback form in the chat and we'll also include it in the follow-up email. And in that email, you will also find the recording. So please keep an eye out for it. And thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.